Hello, welcome to our mini Bible series as we continue the journey this week to the ninth Sunday after Pentecost, August 2nd, 2020. Today is the Thursday, July the 30th, and it's a little hard to believe that July is almost over, at least for me it is. Today we look at the gospel reading for this coming Sunday, which is Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. So before I begin the reflections, I will read that for you, beginning with the introduction for the gospel. After Jesus the Baptist, After John the Baptist is murdered, Jesus desires a time of solitude. Still, his compassion for others will not allow him to dismiss those who need him, and he is moved to perform one of his greatest miracles. Now, when Jesus heard about the beheading of John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. Where he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured the sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said to them, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Stories of Jesus feeding huge crowds with only a little bit of food were an important part of the earliest traditions of Jesus' followers, who became known as the Christians. All 4 gospel readings include at least one feeding story, and some 2. One of feeding 5,000 men, not including women and children, and one of feeding 4,000. Some who oppose Christianity point out that these different stories are just evidence that no one could keep the stories straight, so therefore they're not true. While others who are supportive of Christianity maintain that the stories are simply 2 separate events in which Jesus performed a similar miracle. In my humble opinion, the debates over whether it was 4,000 or 5,000, whether it included men, women, and children, or just men, or whether there were 2 events or 1 event, all of those debates are simply, as I call them, majoring in the minors for the sake of argument and someone's need to be right. I think it more important to focus on what the stories teach us about God. The stories echo a common theme in Israel's experience of God. Like bread and fish feed the hungry crowd in the wilderness, or translated as a deserted place in Sunday's reading, manna in the wilderness provided daily sustenance for the Israelites during the Exodus wanderings. Isaiah speaks of the abundance of food, drink, and rich food for those without money to buy it, and in our first reading for Sunday. This gospel narrative of Jesus was reminiscent of the accounts of Elijah and the widow Zarephath, and Elisha feeding 100. Jesus' actions over the bread simply echoes the customs of Jewish meals. Christians here in these actions, the elements of the Christian Eucharist, or what we call Holy Communion. Jesus' blessing and breaking of the bread are the same as those in the gospel accounts where Jesus breaks the bread with the disciples in the Last Supper. A distinctive feature in Matthew's story is the transition from John the Baptist's grisly death by beheading to feeding crowds. In all three synoptic Gospels, that is, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the feeding of the 5,000 follows the account of John's death. Yet each of those narratives have the transition reported just a little bit differently. Mark and Luke have the two stories disconnected yet close together. Matthew seems to intentionally connect the two stories. According to Matthew, Jesus withdraws to be by himself in a deserted place after receiving the report of John's death. And the mention of a deserted place, or perhaps we might even say the wilderness, invites we as the listeners to consider another very potent biblical metaphor. The wilderness, it's a barren place, it's lonely, it's deserted, mostly uninhabitable, it's desolate. It literally and metaphorically is a wilderness. Wilderness is a good place to go to be by yourself, whether it is to grieve or to pray or to repent or to fast. It's a lonely place, although it is not a place from which God is absent, because God is always present. It's just that there are no distractions in the wilderness. So it can be a place of spiritual intensity and spiritual renewal. For Jesus, it was a place to grieve the death of his friend and relative, John. In this gospel, Jesus' time in the wilderness is cut short by the crowds that follow him there and have needs. The gospel tells us that Jesus is moved with compassion for the crowds. And while the reading does not say so, I think it also may be true that the disciples were moved with compassion. The difference was in how they reacted to that emotion. The disciples take a very reasoned and logical approach and want to send the crowds away into the towns and villages so that they can buy food for themselves. Jesus takes a more spiritual approach and decides that the disciples and he can feed them. There are those, even today, who look for ways to rationalize this story so that it doesn't act so much as a miracle, suggesting that perhaps everyone just brought food with them, and the disciples and Jesus were able to convince them somehow that sharing food with each other was a good thing to do. And this is a good thought. There's nothing wrong with the thought of sharing. Sharing is a commendable action. Yet once again, I think it is majoring in the minors for the sake of a debate that misses or tries to circumvent the connection here to the miracle and God's abundance. This gospel readily connects to our first reading from Isaiah, where the point is that new life in God is demonstrated by God's invitation. Let me read for you again from Isaiah. You that have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy milk and wine without money and without price. Resurrection life in Jesus. As I've been talking about resurrection life for us since the day of Pentecost we celebrated, resurrection life is new life in God. And it is demonstrated in Sunday's gospel with Jesus providing an abundance of sustenance without cost. At the same time that I believe it is necessary to emphasize that this story is a miracle feeding, I do not want to dismiss any idea that the crowds learned something about compassion and about caring for one another because of Jesus' teaching. Imagine the crowds experiencing the transformative power of Jesus' presence when he invites them to make themselves comfortable in the grass. The whole scene is now transformed. Jesus is the host, and they are honored guests at the meal that Jesus is providing. And when Jesus blessed the loaves, the crowd could sense that this meal had become something special. This is no ordinary picnic. This is not just bread and fish. Jesus has transformed this meal into God's abundant invitation to a feast. Imagine as the disciples moved through the crowds, distributing the food. No one feared there would not be enough. No one had a sense that I need to think first about myself and my family and grab everything I can. No one worried about their own needs alone. The men shared with their wives and sisters and mothers, and the children were fed first. Imagine Jesus' compassion becomes contagious in the way that the people cared for and about one another. Imagine Jesus' healing touch when he cured the sick inspired them to such gratitude for a simple yet abundant meal, especially by wilderness standards. So let us not diminish Jesus' miracle, nor dismiss the teaching moment where the disciples learn new possibilities for distributing food to a hungry crowd so that there's enough for everyone. The images and the experiences called to mind in this simple, ancient feeding story are also for us in our present tense. They open us to the transformative power of Jesus in our lives, resurrection life, so that when we break bread together, we are reminded that while we have more than enough, there are those who do not have even enough. Thank you for joining me again this week as we go through these mini Bible series in preparation for Sunday, this case the 9th Sunday after the Pentecost, August 2nd, 2020. Have a great day and God bless.